pictured two kinds of violence. In the first, a handful of men decide in an afternoon to ambush a rival camp, carry what food they can hold in their hands, and go home the same week, win or lose. In the second, thousands of men who've never met each other show up on the same day, in the same place, already fed, already equipped, ready to march for months. Both get called war. Anthropologists who study conflict across hundreds of societies will tell you those are almost different phenomena, and figuring out exactly when humanity crossed from one into the other is what this episode is about. Researchers like Keith Otterbein, who coded dozens of societies for military sophistication, point to 5 things that separate a raid from organized war. Real command authority instead of loose consensus, deliberate logistics instead of living off whatever you're carrying, weeks of planning instead of a decision made in an afternoon, hundreds or thousands of fighters instead of a few dozen, and, maybe the biggest one, people whose actual job is soldier, fed and equipped by their community, instead of farmers who occasionally fight and then go back to their fields. Lawrence Keeley spent a whole book proving small-scale societies were plenty lethal. He wasn't wrong, but even he draws a line between the ambush and the siege. Killing people and organizing an army to hold territory are not automatically the same skill. Azar Gatt mapped this onto a familiar ladder: bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states, each rung adding a little more command structure, a little more stored surplus, a little more capacity to field and feed a fighting force. And there's a real theory for why some places climbed that ladder and others didn't. Robert Carnero's circumscription theory points at geography. In a river valley boxed in by desert or mountains, a defeated group can't just walk away and start over somewhere empty. They have to submit. And a society that can force the losers to stay and be absorbed, rather than simply scattering them, ends up with more people, more land, and more tax base to fund the next fight. A one-way ratchet toward bigger, more organized war, running exactly through places like the Mesopotamian floodplain. Here's an honest complication, though. Not everyone agrees this is one continuous story. Keeley, Gatt, and, in the popular version, Steven Pinker, argue organized war is basically raiding with better tools, the same coalitional aggression, just scaled up by political complexity. Douglas Fry and R. Brian Ferguson push back hard, arguing that large-scale, standing, institutional warfare shows up surprisingly late and unevenly in the record, tightly tied to centralized states rather than flowing naturally out of small band psychology, that it had to be built, not just scaled. Nobody disputes that raiding is ancient. What's still genuinely contested is whether an army is just a bigger raiding party or a different invention entirely. One of the best physical candidates for watching that invention happen sits at Tel Hamoukar in what's now northeastern Syria. Around 3500 BCE, the site was destroyed in an attack that left over 1,000 oval clay sling bullets in the rubble. Walls collapsed under what the excavation team bluntly called shock and awe in the Fourth Millennium B.C. That's not an ambush. That's a coordinated assault on a settlement. Who did it is still debated. The leading theory points at the expanding Uruk culture to the south, based on what shows up in the layers built afterward, but that's an inference, not a confession. Around the same centuries, Uruk itself was growing into a genuine city of tens of thousands, ringed with real defensive walls, exactly the kind of place Carnero's model predicts should start producing organized militaries. The Sumerian king list, compiled generations later, adds the piece that mattered just as much as any wall, an idea. It describes kingship as a single thing, handed down from city to city like an object, tying legitimate rule directly to the right to lead men in war. That's not just a story, it's the beginning of an argument for why strangers should follow one man's orders at all. Which brings us to Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 to 2279 BCE. What survives of his own inscriptions includes a detail historians keep coming back to: 5,400 men who ate bread daily before him. Not farmers called up for the season and sent home after. Men fed year-round by the state, whose entire occupation was soldiering. Every earlier Sumerian city-state had fought with citizen levies, conscripted men who marched for a campaign and went straight back to their fields, which meant no army could stay in the field longer than a single growing season allowed. Sargon's force didn't have that leash. It could march for years. It could garrison a city instead of just raiding it and leaving. And that one difference, soldiers who don't have to go home to farm, is most of what it took to turn a collection of city-states into history's first known multi-city empire. None of that runs on willpower. It runs on grain. Feeding thousands of men who grow nothing themselves means centralized storage, centralized taxation, and this is where the record actually gets specific: early cuneiform ration lists and labor rosters, tracking exactly who got fed, where, and for how long. It's the same surplus and storage problem this series covered with the first fortresses, scaled up until it could fund a standing military instead of just defending a granary. And feeding an army isn't enough on its own either. You also need soldiers who aren't your cousins or your neighbors to actually obey you, which is where divine kingship and state religion come in. An ideology built specifically to justify authority over men who have no personal reason to trust you. Worth a quick, honest aside, though. The famous story of Sargon's birth, a low-born child set adrift on the river in a reed basket, rescued, later favored by a goddess, only survives in copies written centuries after he actually lived, and it's the exact same structure later attached to Moses and to Cyrus the Great. Historians treat it as retrospective propaganda for a king who needed a good origin story, not as biography. And that's really the point this episode keeps circling. Everything this series has traced about human coalitional instinct, who we trust, who we'll fight for, who counts as us, evolved for groups of maybe a few dozen people who actually knew each other. None of that scales cleanly to getting 5,000 strangers to show up fed, stay in formation, and not desert for years for a king they've never spoken to. What Sargon actually built wasn't a bigger raiding party. It was a workaround for a coordination problem evolution never equipped the human mind to solve on its own. Rank, ideology, and a filing system standing in for the kinship and reputation that hold a small band together. The killing machine wasn't the army, it was everything invisible underneath it that made thousands of strangers act like one.